Chapter 2. There were still 2 hours of early summer sunlight when Sally Stevens finished her weekly shopping. While Mr. Winters was carefully placing the supplies in the back of the buckboard, she sent a boy to the Gold Eagle Saloon to tell Pat that she was ready to go. Pat emerged through the swinging doors almost immediately and sauntered down the boardwalk to the store with a faint look of guilt on his face. Sally noted the look with an inward smile. Though they'd been married 12 years, she'd never been able to convince him that she wanted him to meet his friends in the saloon and have a few companionship drinks while she was doing her shopping. Other husbands had to sneak into the saloon on like occasions, and Pat had never got rid of the feeling that he ought by rights to sneak in too. As he came up to her in front of the store, Sally took his arm and said gaily, "Don't look like that, Pat, and don't start telling me how many drinks you haven't had. You ought to know by this time I don't care." The storekeeper glanced over his shoulder at them as he placed the last case of canned goods in the buckboard and said disapprovingly, "I thought you two was married." Pat put his arm about Sally's slim waist and grinned at Mr. Winters. "Oh, you know we're old married folks." "Well, I've been thinking that for years, but doggone it if I'm not beginning to wonder, but you living in sin. No wife I ever knew treated a man like Sally treats you, Pat." His grin widened and he swung Sally towards the loaded buckboard. "Oh, he's just an old man with evil thoughts, Sally. Hop up and we'll drive off before we get insulted." Sally bit her underlip to keep from laughing as Pat sat down beside her. She said, "We're not going to be old married folks, are we?" "Well, not as long as you keep looking like a gal that oughtn't to be let out of her mama's sight," Pat assured her comfortably. "Nor as long as you send me off to help some gal ain't neither of us ever seen neither." "I thought you were going to the Big Bend on a buying trip for Mexican heifers," Sally countered. "Oh, sure. I'd mighty near forgotten about them heifers." Pat paused, and then added with a pleased smile, "Got to talking to old Jeff Harkins on the Gold Eagle. He's agreeable to taking care of the express station for Ezra next 2 or 3 weeks." Sally replied, "You're not wasting any time getting things fixed right up." "Can't afford to. Not if I'm going to be riding into Marfa before that stage gets there next Friday." They were approaching a cross road east of the town where the road forked due south into the mountains. Sally turned in the seat to look back at the sun hanging well above the jagged continental divide and suggested, "There's enough time to drive out to the express station if you want, and then we could take the shortcut directly to the ranch." Pat nodded as though no thought had been in his mind. "Well, all right, if you're dead set upon it." He pulled the team of bays into the right-hand fork. "I'd like to see how Kitty Lane has fixed up the station." "Kitty Salone," Pat reminded her. "Ms. Kitty Salone." "Is Sam happy with her, Pat?" Sally's voice suddenly became serious. "Oh, he's as happy as an old prospector that hit it rich after 40 years of trying and failing." "It seems so queer. I just can't imagine Sam Sloane married." "He's settled down to her like any horse after he's broke the harness. Kitty's kind of like you, Sally. She's got sense enough to know a man don't change his ways just because he stood up in front of a preacher. Only thing is, it's sort of tough on Ezra living there with him." "I should think he'd like it, having a woman to do the cooking and cleaning of house." Pat grinned wearily. "He's missing them top-heavy flapjacks he used to line his belly with every morning. The ones Kitty makes are so light he can never get himself filled up. and she's got a funny idea that a coffee pot had ought to be washed out and set away every time it's used. Never does give the coffee a chance to get strong and bitter like it does after 3 days of simmering with the old grounds left in. Sally laughed musically at Pat's description of the red-headed bachelor's predicament. She knew that what he had said was at least partially true. In the past she had tried to persuade Ezra to come and live with them, but always received some evasive excuse from the one-eyed giant. She had a feeling, though, that it went much deeper than a mere liking for his own particular brand of cooking. Though Ezra was outwardly rough and uncouth, Sally knew that he was inwardly very sensitive about the ugly facial deformity that had taken one of his eyes and terribly scarred his face. He was conscious that his ugliness made him repulsive to most women, and that he could never hope to have a wife and family of his own, and that very fact, Sally was sure, made it dreadfully hard for him to see his partners happily married. It hadn't been so bad when he and Sam Sloane lived together after Pat's defection, but now that Sam was gone and gotten married too. Sally compressed her lips and tried to keep from feeling sorry for Ezra. For all of his huge frame and rough ways, he was as gentle as a woman and easily hurt as a child. This trip with Pat down into Texas would be good for him. She was glad that she had suggested it. It might be dangerous, but she was confident in the ability of Ezra and her husband to overcome any danger that might confront them. Sally aroused herself from her thoughts as the buckboard bounced up out of a deep gully onto the flat expanse leading to the Pony Express station that was just a tiny black dot ahead of them in the last glow of the evening sun. "Will Sam be at the station when we get there?" Pat considered her question for a moment and then nodded. "I reckon. He should have made the trip back from Dutch Springs this morning." "How's he going to take it, Pat?" "Take what?" Pat Stevens glanced at his wife sharply. "You and Ezra riding off together on an adventure. Is he going to feel badly about being left behind?" Pat chuckled. "He'll be as happy about it as a black bear with an itch. But he's got to ride the Pony Express, and he and Kitty ain't been married long enough for her to be tired of him being around, like you got with me." "I guess not," Sally responded. She relaxed and leaned her shoulder against Pat, watching while the tiny black dot swiftly took shape and resolved itself into a lone cabin by the side of the lonely road leading south into New Mexico. Originally it had been a 2-room shack with corrals and sheds in the rear, but when Sam Sloane married the dance hall entertainer and brought her to the station for her honeymoon, he had expanded the building with 2 extra rooms and a lean-to kitchen. Ezra sat in a chair propped back against the front wall of the building as the buckboard pulled up. He was hatless, and his tousled hair was crimson under the dying rays of the sun. His single eye gleamed with a surprised welcome, and he rocked his chair forward onto 4 legs and got up, and his voice boomed out loudly into the afternoon hush. "Dang it if it ain't all city folks comin' for a visit. Light and set your backsides, folks. Doggone it, Sally, if you don't look as pert as a newborn colt in there with that there pink sunbonnet." Ezra's scarred face was wreathed with a huge smile of gladness as he advanced upon the buckboard and held out his hand to engulf Sally and lift her down lightly. The front door of the station opened before him, and Miss Sam Sloane came hurried out to greet them with outstretched hands. She was hatless and without rouge. Her corn-colored hair was arranged in 2 simple braids that wound about her head, and she wore a simple gingham dress with the sleeves rolled up above the elbows. Her hands were wet, and there was a smudge of flour across her forehead and she looked 100 times prettier than when she used to be all fixed up to entertain the boys at the saloon in town, and about 20 years younger. Pat Stevens thought confusedly as she greeted them gaily and then went on to Sally. He and Ezra stood there awkwardly while Kitty and Sally exchanged greetings, then went inside, chatting happily together. Pat looked at Ezra and winked towards the door through which the women had gone. "Looks like Sam did all right for himself, huh?" "Yep, Kitty's a fine woman." Ezra spat a stream of tobacco juice on a green lizard that scurried across the hard-baked ground. "Mighty fine," he added, in a tone that was almost a groan. "Well, you don't seem too happy about it." Ezra twisted his head to glance over his shoulder. In a low, fierce tone, he explained. "It's driving me crazy, Pat. That's what it's doing. I don't hardly see Sam no more. When he ain't riding the mail or sleeping, he's out there lollygagging about Kitty. I might as well be a hitching post for all the attention anyone pays to me around here." "Well, looks like you're getting fed good at least." Pat surveyed his huge frame. "I don't see no signs of withering or decay." Ezra sighed deeply. "Sure, I'm getting fed a-plenty. No work to take it off me, neither." "Taking care of the horses, don't you?" Ezra snorted angrily. "Feed and water a dozen horses twice a day. Now I tell you, Pat, is that any job for a growed-up man?" "You knew what it would be when you took it on." "Yeah, but I didn't know you'd be playing Cupid and helping old Sam get married," Ezra grumbled. "I figured we'd play some euchre and cribbage to pass the time away. Ain't had a game with 'em since she moved in here. Now, know what him and her's doing when they're not kissing or something?" "What?" asked Pat with a sly grin. "Playing hearts, that's what. It's a silly card game she taught 'em. No guts to her like euchre or cribbage." "Oh, that's too bad." Pat squatted down on his heels with his back against the front wheel of the buckboard. He got out cigarette paper and some tobacco from his shirt pocket and carefully fashioned a cigarette. As he licked it, he asked, "You aren't thinking of quitting, are you?" "I ain't thinking of nothing else." Ezra looked and turned away with a sour grunt. He settled himself into the creaking chair and rocked it back against the wall on its two rear legs. "I get to thinking about the old times while I'm setting here doing nothing. Things are turning mighty tame, Pat. What's the use of a man living any more? There's nothing to do." "Well, we are getting old," Pat reminded him. "Time we was setting down and letting the young bucks have their turn." Ezra snorted. "Maybe you're getting old, you and Sam. Getting married ages a man, I reckon." Pat replied, "I reckon." He blew out a contemplative puff of blue smoke. The sound of animated women talk floated out to them through the open door of the cabin. The front legs of Ezra's chair thumped down on the hard dirt. His one eye glared at Pat, and the jagged scar down his cheek was an angry red. "But I ain't married," he declared loudly. "No, you sure aren't. And what more, I ain't studyin' none about getting married neither." "Well, now maybe you ought to. I heard tell of a whiter woman the other day." "Don't you spring no whiter woman on me, Pat Stevens. I've seen too much of this here marriage. Makes a man old and lazy. I figure I'll take out of Powder Valley and leave you and Sam here to rot." "Well, where are you going to go?" "What's it matter?" Ezra made a wide gesture with a clenched fist the size of a small ham. Anywhere I reckon we better than this. Pat took the last draw on a cigarette and spun it away. I've been thinking of taking a little trip, going and get some heifers. Up to Denver, I reckon, or Pablo, maybe. There was a sneer in the words. Well, no, actually, south, down to the Big Bend country. To buy heifers? Ezra looked at him incredulously. Pat nodded. I've heard there's some bargains down there if a feller plays his cards right. Mexican stock, smuggling across the border? Pat shrugged his wide shoulders. Ain't no need to ask a man where they come from or how he runs into such a good bargain. Ezra slapped his thigh with a delighted oath. Sounds like a good deal. When do we start? I don't reckon you'd want to go along with an old duffer like me, though, would you, eh? Sure, I'll go along. Someone's got to protect you. What about the station? I'm leaving tomorrow. Ezra's face fell and he muttered. Yeah, that's right. Somebody's got to feed the damn beasts. Pat offered. I talked to Jeff Harkins in town. Jeff, what's that old coot want? A job. He ain't worth... Say, you reckon he'd take this job off my hands, Pat? You reckon he would? I told him to be here tomorrow. Pat grinned at the big, red-haired man. By God, Pat. Ezra stared at him in speechless rage. Someday I'm going to take that scrawny neck of yours in my hands and tear it apart, edging me along that way. Pat stood up and stretched with his arms over his head. He yawned and said mildly, I wanted to make sure you weren't getting soft sitting around the station eating Kitty's good cooking and all. Sam asleep? Yep. Ezra chuckled delightedly. He'll be plenty mad when we go riding off for the border without him. I don't think so, Pat protested. Kitty'll make him glad he stayed behind. He turned to the buckboard as Kitty and Sally came out arm in arm. We'll be getting along, Ezra. I'll ride by for you tomorrow about noontime. I'll be waiting. Make sure you're wearing guns, Pat said casually. Might be we'd have a little trouble rounding up a herd. Ezra grinned happily. Sounds like old times right enough. Then he came close as Sally got on the backboard and asked Pat in a hoarse undertone. What about that sheriff's star you've been wearing? What about it? You wearing it with you to the Big Bend? I'll keep it out of sight, Pat promised. No use in us getting shot before we even start buying steers. As they wheeled away from the station towards a shortcut leading across country directly to the Lazy Mare Ranch, Pat sighed and muttered, Can't help but feel sorry for Sam. He'll be mighty put out that we didn't even ask him to go with us. Don't feel sorry for Sam Salone, said Sally. Her tone of dreamy placidness brought Pat's gaze around sharply. What do you mean? He wouldn't want to be asked, she told him with conviction. Kitty's going to be having a baby. Pat opened his mouth to say something, and it stayed open a long time. Then he said, Well, I'll be damned. Old Sam, a pappy. And then he doubled forward with a howling laughter. End of chapter 2.